Hello everyone, tonight I've got 3 special scary stories for all of you. So before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. This happened during a business trip to Las Vegas. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. I know it sounds weird to call a hotel room a house, but when you spend 3 weeks straight living out of a suitcase in a city you hate, that small square of carpet starts to feel like the only home you have. I was there for a tech convention, and by the 10th day I was completely drained. The lights, the noise, and the constant crowds on the strip were starting to make me feel claustrophobic. It was around 10:45 p.m. when I finally made it back to the hotel. The lobby was a chaotic mess of tourists and ringing slot machines. I went to the front desk to complain about my key card, which had stopped working for the 3rd time that week. The clerk looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. He didn't even look at me as he typed away at his computer. He just muttered something about a system glitch and handed me a new key with a different room number written on the sleeve. I told him that wasn't my room, but he just shook his head and said my old room was being serviced for a leak. He told me they had moved my bags to room 1408-B in the West Wing. I'd never heard of a room having a letter after the number, but I was too tired to argue. I just grabbed the key and headed toward the elevators. The West Wing was the oldest part of the building, tucked away behind the main casino floor. As I walked, the noise of the slot machines started to fade away. The bright, flashing neon was replaced by dim, flickering overhead lights and a heavy smell of stale cigarette smoke trapped in the carpet. I followed the signs for the 1400 wing, but the further I walked, the more the hallway seemed to narrow. The walls were covered in an old, yellowish wallpaper with a pattern that looked like tangled vines. It was a stark contrast to the modern luxury of the main lobby. I eventually reached the 14th floor. I pulled out the little paper map the clerk had given me, but something was off. The map showed that the rooms went from 1400 to 1460, and then the hallway just ended at a fire exit. There was no mention of a room 1408-B. I walked down the long corridor, checking the numbers on the heavy wooden doors. 1404, 1406, 1408. Next to room 1408, there was a small, recessed alcove that I hadn't noticed on the map. It was tucked behind a large, humming vending machine that looked like it hadn't been stocked since the 90s. In that alcove was a single door with a small, brass plate that read 1408-B. I felt a slight chill, but I figured it was just the air conditioning kicking in. I swiped my card, the light turned green, and I pushed the door open. The room was surprisingly large, but it felt cold and empty. My suitcases were sitting on the bed just like the clerk said they would be. I didn't bother unpacking. I just kicked off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence in the room was heavy. Usually in Vegas, you can hear the muffled sound of traffic or distant music, but here it was dead quiet. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic buzzing of the vending machine outside my door. I decided to go back out to the vending machine to grab a bottle of water before bed. It was about 11:15 p.m. at this point. I stepped out into the hallway and let the door click shut behind me. I turned to the vending machine, but as I reached for my wallet, I realized something was different. The machine wasn't humming anymore. In fact, it looked completely different. The bright Coca-Cola logo was gone, replaced by a blank, frosted glass panel. I frowned and looked down the hallway to my left. The corridor seemed much longer than it had been 2 minutes ago. I remember seeing the elevators just a few doors down, but now the hallway just stretched on into a dark blur. I turned to my right, expecting to see the fire exit, but there was just more hallway. The yellow wallpaper seemed to be vibrating slightly under the dim lights. I felt a sudden surge of vertigo and reached back for my door handle. My hand met flat, cold wallpaper. I spun around, my heart jumping into my throat. The door to room 1408-B was gone. There wasn't even a frame or a seam in the wall. It was just a solid, unbroken stretch of that hideous yellow pattern. I started to panic, breathing heavily as I looked up and down the corridor. I was standing in a hallway that shouldn't exist, trapped outside a room that had vanished. I started walking toward where I thought the elevators were. I walked for what felt like 5 minutes, but the doors I passed didn't make sense. The numbers were jumping around. I saw 1412, then 1499, then a door with no number at all. Every time I looked away and then looked back, the numbers seemed to shift. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was just exhausted and my eyes were playing tricks on me. I decided to try one of the doors. I grabbed the handle of room 1422 and twisted it. It was locked. I tried the next one and the next. Every single door was locked tight. I started to run, my footsteps thudding dully on the thick carpet. The air felt thick and dusty, like it hadn't been breathed in years. I finally saw a sign for the stairs and lunged for the heavy metal door. I shoved it open and burst into the stairwell. I expected to see concrete steps and a handrail, but instead I was looking into another hallway. It was identical to the one I had just left. The same yellow wallpaper, the same dim lights, and the same heavy silence. I stepped through the doorway and looked back, but the door I had just come through was gone. I was standing in the middle of a long, windowless corridor with no exits in sight. I checked my phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. The clock on my screen read 12:12 a.m. I had been wandering for nearly an hour, even though it felt like minutes. I started to yell for help, but my voice felt flat as if the walls were absorbing the sound. There was no echo, no response, just the distant, faint sound of someone or something walking on the floor above me. The footsteps were heavy and slow. They followed a steady rhythm, thud, thud, thud. I looked up at the ceiling, watching the light fixtures rattle slightly with every step. The footsteps stopped directly above my head. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling tiles. After a few seconds, the sound started again, but this time it sounded like something was being dragged, a long, scraping sound that made my skin crawl. I turned and ran in the opposite direction. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away from that sound. As I ran, I noticed the hallway was changing again. The walls were starting to slant inward and the ceiling was getting lower. I had to hunch over just to keep moving. The air was getting hotter, smelling of old paper and ozone. I felt like the building was swallowing me whole. I finally saw a small wooden door at the very end of the narrowing passage. It didn't have a room number. It just had a small handwritten sign taped to it that said maintenance. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the handle and threw my entire weight against it. The door gave way and I stumbled forward, falling onto a hard, cold floor. I braced myself for another endless hallway, but instead I felt the smell of laundry detergent and heard the roar of industrial machines. I was in the hotel's basement laundry room. Huge washing machines were spinning and a group of workers were folding white sheets at a long table. They all stopped and stared at me like I was a lunatic. I was covered in dust, sweating and shaking uncontrollably. One of the workers, an older woman, walked over to me and asked if I was okay. I couldn't even find the words to answer her. I eventually made it back to the lobby. The bright lights and the noise of the casino felt like a physical assault on my senses. I went straight to the front desk, but the clerk from earlier was gone. A young woman was there instead. I told her I needed to get my bags from room 1408-B. She looked at me with a confused expression and started typing into her computer. She frowned and told me there was no room 1408-B. She said the 1400 wing only went up to room 1460, and there were no B rooms in the entire hotel. I pulled out the key sleeve the previous clerk had given me to show her, but when I looked at it, the ink was gone. It was just a blank white piece of cardboard. I felt a sick knot form in my stomach. I insisted that she check the West Wing, but she told me the West Wing had been closed for renovations for over 6 months. She said there was no power or water running to that part of the building. I asked her about the clerk who had checked me in, describing him in detail. She looked uneasy and told me that nobody matching that description worked at the hotel. In fact, she said the desk had been short-staffed all night, and she was the only one on duty since 8 p.m. The hotel's security eventually agreed to take me up to the 14th floor. We walked down the hallway and it looked exactly like it had when I first arrived, modern, well-lit, and perfectly normal. When we got to the end, there was no alcove, no vending machine, no room 1408-B, there was just a solid blank wall where the hallway ended at the fire exit. My bags were nowhere to be found. I checked out of the hotel that night and stayed at a cheap motel near the airport. I didn't sleep a wink. I kept thinking about those footsteps above me and the way the hallway seemed to stretch and warp. The hotel never found my luggage, and they eventually stopped returning my calls. They claimed I never even checked in that night, despite the charge appearing on my credit card statement a few days later. The weirdest part happened a week after I got back home. I was unpacking a spare bag I'd kept in my car when I found a small brass room plate at the bottom of the pocket. It was the plate from the door, etched with the numbers 1408-B. I don't know how it got there. I never touched the door plate, but as I held it, I realized the brass was freezing cold, as if it had been sitting in an air-conditioned room that didn't exist. I still have the plate, but I keep it locked in a drawer in my garage. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear a faint, rhythmic humming coming from that drawer. It sounds exactly like a vending machine. I try to ignore it, but I can't help but wonder if that hallway is still out there, waiting for the next exhausted traveler to be handed the wrong key. Story 2. Back in the summer, I spent traveling through Arizona on Interstate 40. I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. At the time, I was 23 years old and moving across the country to start a new life in California. I didn't have much money, so I was driving an old sedan that didn't even have working air conditioning. The heat was brutal, especially once I hit the desert stretches of the Southwest. By the time I reached the middle of Arizona, I was exhausted and could barely keep my eyes open. It was around 10:45 p.m. when I realized I couldn't drive any further. The road was pitch black, and the only things I could see were the small reflectors on the pavement and the occasional pair of headlights passing me in the opposite direction. I started looking for a place to stay, but I was in a very remote area. Eventually, I saw a flickering neon sign for a place called the Desert Sands Motel. It looked like the kind of place you see in old movies, one level, U-shaped, and definitely seen better days. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, which was mostly empty except for a rusted-out pickup truck and a dusty SUV. The office was a small, cramped room with a thick plexiglass window separating the clerk from the customers. The man behind the glass looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He didn't ask for much identification, and I paid in cash for a single night. He handed me a heavy metal key for room number 14 and pointed toward the far end of the lot. The air outside was still incredibly hot, even though it was late. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat and walked over to my room. The door was made of heavy wood, but it creaked loudly when I pushed it open. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner hit me immediately. It wasn't the cleanest place, but for $40, I wasn't expecting much. I just needed a bed for a few hours before I got back on the road. I locked the deadbolt and did a quick sweep of the room. There was a single queen-sized bed with a thin, scratchy floral bedspread. A small television was bolted to a dresser, and there was a window that looked out toward the back of the property. I noticed right away that the walls were paper-thin. I could hear the faint hum of an air conditioning unit from the room next door, and every now and then I heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the floorboards. I tried to settle in, but I felt an odd sense of unease. I've always been a bit jumpy in new places, especially budget motels in the middle of nowhere. I decided to take a quick shower to cool down, but the water pressure was terrible and the pipes made a loud, screeching noise every time I turned the handle. When I finished, I sat on the edge of the bed and checked my phone. I didn't have any service, which wasn't surprising given how far out I was. By midnight, I was lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The motel was mostly quiet, except for the occasional car passing by on the interstate. I was just starting to drift off when I heard a muffled sound from the room next to mine, room 15. It sounded like someone was moving furniture around. There was a dull thud, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. I figured the person next door was just settling in late like I was. I rolled over and tried to ignore it, but then the noises changed. It wasn't dragging or thumping anymore. It sounded like someone was tapping on the wall. It wasn't a random tap either. It was rhythmic, 3 slow knocks, a pause, and then 3 more. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. The tapping stopped for a minute, and then I heard a low, muffled voice. It was too quiet to make out what they were saying, but it sounded like a frantic whispering. I remember thinking that maybe the person next door was having a bad dream or talking in their sleep. I tried to close my eyes again, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but then the whispering got louder. It sounded like the person had moved closer to the wall, right where my head was resting against the headboard. I froze when I heard a distinct sound. It was a sharp, raspy intake of breath, and then a single word that made my heart stop. Marcus. I sat up instantly, my skin crawling with goosebumps. I looked around the dark room, my eyes searching the shadows. I hadn't told anyone at the motel my name. I hadn't even given the clerk my full name, just the last name for the register, and I'd paid in cash. There was no way anyone in the room next door should know who I was. I sat there in total silence for what felt like 10 minutes, waiting to see if I had imagined it. The silence was heavy and suffocating. I started to wonder if I was just overtired and hallucinating from the long drive. I reached over and turned on the small bedside lamp. The dim yellow light didn't offer much comfort, but it made me feel a little less vulnerable. I stared at the wall shared with room 15. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, and there was a small water stain near the ceiling. It looked completely ordinary. Just as I was about to turn the light back off, I heard it again. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, steady voice, sounding like it was coming from someone standing right on the other side of the drywall. "I know you're awake, Marcus. I can hear you moving." The voice was cold and lacked any emotion. It didn't sound like a friend or anyone I knew. It sounded like someone who had been watching me for a long time. My blood turned to ice. I didn't say a word. I didn't want to acknowledge that I could hear them. I slowly reached for my shoes, trying to be as quiet as possible. My plan was to grab my bag and get out of there as fast as I could. I didn't care about the $40 or getting any sleep anymore. Something was seriously wrong. As I reached for my backpack, the voice spoke again, and this time it was even closer. "The door is locked, but the window isn't, Marcus." I looked over at the window. I had checked the lock when I first arrived, but now in the dim light I saw that the latch was slightly crooked. I couldn't remember if I had actually pushed it all the way down. I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. I didn't want to go near the window to check it. The thought of a face appearing behind the glass was too much to handle. I grabbed my keys from the nightstand, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped them. I stood up and the floorboards beneath me gave a loud, agonizing creak. Immediately there was a loud bang on the wall from the other side. It was so hard that a small picture frame on my wall fell off its hook and hit the carpet. I didn't wait another second. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the deadbolt. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I finally got the door open and burst out into the warm night air. I didn't look back at room 15. I ran straight to my car and threw my bag into the passenger seat. As I was fumbling to get the key into the ignition, I looked toward the office. The lights were out and the clerk was nowhere to be seen. But then I looked toward the window of room 15. The curtains were closed, but I could see a silhouette of a person standing perfectly still behind them. They weren't moving at all, just watching me from behind the fabric. I started the engine and threw the car into reverse, kicking up gravel as I sped out of the parking lot. I didn't stop driving until I found a well-lit truck stop about 30 miles down the interstate. It was 2:15 a.m. when I pulled into a spot under a bright fluorescent light. There were plenty of people around, truckers getting coffee and families stretching their legs. I finally felt like I could breathe again, but the fear hadn't left me. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to make sense of what happened. How did they know my name? How did they know I was traveling alone? I started thinking back to the gas station where I had stopped for fuel about an hour before finding the motel. I remembered a man in a dusty SUV who had been standing near the air pump looking in my direction while I was at the pump. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now the memory made my stomach churn. I stayed at that truck stop until the sun came up. I was too terrified to close my eyes even for a second. Every time someone walked past my car, I jumped. When it finally got light out, I went inside and bought a large coffee. The cashier was a friendly older woman who asked if I was doing okay. I must have looked like a wreck. I just nodded and told her I had a long night on the road. I didn't want to explain the nightmare I had just experienced. I finished my trip to California without stopping at another motel. I drove straight through, fueled by caffeine and pure adrenaline. For weeks after I arrived, I couldn't sleep through the night. Every time I heard a noise in the hallway of my new apartment, I would freeze, expecting to hear that raspy voice call out my name. I even changed my phone number and made all my social media accounts private, just in case someone was following me online. A few months later, I decided to look up the Desert Sands Motel online, just to see if anyone else had reported anything strange. I found a few reviews complaining about the dirt and the noise, but nothing like what I went through. However, I did find a local news article from a few years prior. It mentioned that a man had been arrested for breaking into several rooms at that specific motel by picking the window latches. He hadn't been caught in a while, and the article said the police believed he might still be in the area. Reading that sent a fresh chill down my spine. The most unsettling part wasn't just that someone might have been trying to get into my room. It was how they knew my name. To this day, I have no explanation for it. I never saw the person's face, and I never went back to that part of Arizona. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in the middle of the night and the house is quiet, I swear I can still hear that muffled tapping on the wall. I don't stay in roadside motels anymore. I'd rather sleep in my car at a crowded rest stop or just keep driving until I reach a major city with a reputable hotel. People always tell me that the desert is beautiful, but when I think of Arizona, I don't think of the sunsets or the canyons. I think of that thin wall, the sound of my own name whispered in the dark, and the feeling that I was being hunted by someone who knew exactly who I was. The scariest part of it all is knowing that whoever was in room 15 is probably still out there. They might be sitting in another budget motel right now, listening through the walls and waiting for the next traveler to check in. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. If I had stayed asleep, or if I had gone over to the window to check the lock, I might not be here to tell this story today. I still have that heavy metal key for room 14. In my rush to leave, I forgot to drop it off at the desk. Sometimes I look at it and think about mailing it back, but I don't want to have anything to do with that place ever again. It sits in the back of my junk drawer, a small, rusted reminder of the night I realized that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes the silence is just waiting for the right moment to speak your name. Story 3. It was the first night in Chicago I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I had traveled to the city for a 3-day conference and decided to stay at a high-rise hotel right in the heart of downtown. It was one of those modern, glass-heavy buildings that looked beautiful from the outside, but felt a bit cold and clinical once you were inside. My room was on the 7th floor, tucked away at the very end of a long, dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I checked in and got settled, it was already late. The city outside was still buzzing with traffic and lights, but the 7th floor was completely silent. I remember feeling a strange sense of isolation as I closed my door and locked the deadbolt. I spent the first few hours just unpacking and watching some mindless television to unwind. The room was nice enough, but the air conditioning had this low, rhythmic hum that made the silence of the room feel even heavier when it finally cycled off. Around 12:15 a.m., I started to get really thirsty. I had finished the 2 small water bottles the hotel provided in the mini fridge, and I didn't feel like paying $8 for another one from the lobby. I remembered seeing an ice machine alcove just a few doors down from my room when I first walked in. I figured I could just grab the plastic bucket, fill it up, and use the ice to chill some tap water. It felt like a simple enough task, so I grabbed my key card and stepped out into the hallway. The hallway felt different than it had earlier in the evening. The overhead lights were dimmed, and some of them were buzzing with a faint, high-pitched sound. I walked the short distance to the alcove, which was a small, recessed area carved into the wall. Inside was a large, silver industrial ice machine and a small vending machine that looked like it hadn't been stocked in years. The light inside the alcove was a harsh, flickering fluorescent bulb that made the whole space feel sickly and pale. I placed my bucket under the dispenser and pushed the button. The machine roared to life, the sound of crashing ice echoing loudly against the tiled walls of the small space. As I stood there waiting for the bucket to fill, I happened to glance up. That was when I noticed it. Tucked into the corner where the ceiling met the wall, right above the ice machine, was a small, black plastic dome. It was clearly a security camera, which made sense for a hotel, but something about it felt off. Inside the plastic dome, there was a tiny, rhythmic red light blinking. It wasn't the steady glow you usually see on professional security systems. This was a fast, aggressive blink that seemed to sync up with the flickering of the overhead fluorescent light. I stared at it for a few seconds, wondering why a hotel would need a camera pointed directly at an ice machine. It felt invasive, like someone was specifically interested in watching people perform this mundane, late-night chore. I grabbed my ice bucket and hurried back to my room, feeling a sudden urge to get behind a locked door. Once I was back inside, I tried to shake off the feeling. I told myself it was just standard hotel security and that I was being paranoid because I was in a strange city. I fixed my water, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't stop thinking about that blinking red light. It felt like a tiny, unblinking eye watching me from the shadows of the hallway. I fell into a restless sleep, but I kept waking up to the sounds of the hotel. I heard the distant chime of the elevator at 1:45 a.m., followed by the muffled sound of footsteps walking past my door. Then at 3:07 a.m., I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed. It was the sound of the ice machine down the hall. I could hear the distinct roar of the ice falling into a bucket, followed by the metallic thud of the dispenser stopping. It stayed quiet for a long time after that, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I kept imagining someone standing in that cramped alcove, staring up at that camera just like I had. The thought made my skin crawl. I eventually drifted off again around 5 a.m., but my dreams were filled with images of grainy black and white footage of myself standing in the hallway. I woke up feeling exhausted and on edge, the morning light filtering through the heavy curtains. I decided to start my day early to get my mind off the weird vibes from the night before. I reached for the remote to turn on the TV, hoping to catch the morning news while I got dressed. When the screen flickered to life, it didn't go to the usual hotel welcome channel or a news station. Instead, the screen was filled with a static-heavy gray image. It took my eyes a moment to adjust to what I was seeing, but when they did, my heart dropped into my stomach. The screen was showing a high-angle view of the ice machine alcove on the 7th floor. The quality was poor, like an old VHS tape, but it was clear enough to recognize the space. I watched, frozen, as a figure walked into the frame. It was me. I was wearing the same gray t-shirt and sweatpants I had worn the night before. I watched myself place the bucket under the dispenser. I watched myself look up at the camera with a confused expression on my face. The footage wasn't live, it was a recording of what had happened at 12:15 a.m. I tried to change the channel, but the remote wouldn't work. I pressed the power button, the volume button, and the input button, but the screen stayed locked on the image of me in the alcove. I watched as the me on the screen finished gathering ice and walked out of the frame, but the video didn't stop there. It kept playing, showing the empty, flickering alcove for several minutes. Then the footage skipped slightly. A new time stamp appeared in the bottom corner. 3:07 a.m. I watched as another figure entered the alcove. It was a man I didn't recognize, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face. He didn't have an ice bucket. He just stood there perfectly still, looking directly up at the camera. He stayed like that for what felt like hours, though the time stamp showed it was only about 5 minutes. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He held the paper up to the camera lens. It was a Polaroid photo, but from the distance of the camera I couldn't see what was on it. He held it there for a few seconds before pinning it to the side of the ice machine with a piece of tape. After he was done, he looked back at the camera, waved slowly, and walked away. The TV screen suddenly cut to black, and then the standard hotel welcome menu popped up as if nothing had happened. I was shaking as I stood up. My first instinct was to call the front desk, but I didn't even know what I would say. How would I explain that the hotel TV was playing private security footage of me? I decided I needed to see if that paper was actually there. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I looked through the peephole first, making sure the hallway was empty, before stepping out and heading toward the ice machine. The hallway felt colder than it had the night before. When I reached the alcove, the flickering light was still buzzing, but the camera dome in the corner was gone. There was just a circular hole in the ceiling with a few frayed wires hanging down. I turned my attention to the side of the ice machine. There, exactly where the man in the video had placed it, was a single Polaroid photo taped to the cold metal. I hesitated for a moment before peeling it off to look at it. The photo was a shot of my hotel room door taken from the hallway. It was clearly taken late at night as the hallway lights were dimmed, but what made my blood run cold was the small detail in the corner of the photo. The door was slightly cracked open, and a pair of eyes were visible in the dark gap, looking out from inside my room. It was a photo of me looking out into the hall, taken at a time when I thought I was completely alone and the door was locked. I didn't wait around to find out more. I ran back to my room, grabbed my suitcase, and shoved my belongings inside without even folding them. I didn't care about the conference or the money I had spent on the room. I just needed to get out of that building. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, my heart hammering against my ribs with every step. When I reached the lobby, I didn't even check out. I just walked straight out the front doors and hailed a cab. I checked into a different hotel across town, one that was much busier and had a more professional staff. I spent the rest of the day in a daze trying to make sense of what had happened. I kept looking at the Polaroid, wondering how someone could have taken that photo without me seeing them. The gap in the door was so small, yet the person was close enough to capture my expression of pure, unconscious vulnerability. It felt like I had been part of a sick performance I didn't know was happening. Later that evening, I tried to call the first hotel to report the incident. I asked to speak to the manager and told him about the camera in the ice machine alcove and the footage on my TV. The manager sounded confused and a bit annoyed. He told me that there were no security cameras on the guest floors of that hotel for privacy reasons. He said the only cameras they had were in the lobby, the elevators, and the emergency exits. He even offered to send me the floor plans to prove it. I told him about the man in the hoodie and the Polaroid, but he just dismissed it as a prank or a misunderstanding. He suggested that maybe I had been dreaming or that someone was playing a joke on me. His lack of concern was infuriating, but it also made me realize that I wasn't going to get any help from them. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the Polaroid again. If there were no cameras on that floor, then how did that footage get on my TV? I spent the rest of my trip in a state of constant hypervigilance. Every time I saw a black dome on a ceiling or a blinking red light, I felt a surge of panic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, even in the new hotel. I flew back home a day early, unable to focus on my work. Even now, months later, I find myself checking the corners of rooms and looking for hidden lenses in every public space I visit. The scariest part of the whole experience isn't just the photo or the video. It's the realization that I have no idea who that man was or why he chose me. I don't know if he was a hotel employee, another guest, or someone who had found a way to bypass the hotel's security. I don't know how many other people he had filmed or where that footage is now. All I know is that for one night in Chicago, I wasn't the only one in control of my own privacy. I still have the Polaroid tucked away in a drawer. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, trying to remember if I actually opened the door that night. I have no memory of doing so. In my mind, the door was locked the entire time, but the photo doesn't lie. It shows me looking out into the darkness, searching for something I couldn't see. And every time I look at it, I can't help but feel that the person behind the camera is still out there, waiting for the next person to go looking for ice in the middle of the night.